Hello, this is Dr. Joe Trout from the physics program at Stockton University. This is a lecture on an introduction to assessment. And in this course, we will study how students in the STEM fields are assessed. So we should begin with a lecture on just what assessments are. So this lecture, lecture one, is an introduction to assessment for the course, the evaluation of student learning. In education, the term assessment refers to a wide variety of methods or tools that educators use to evaluate and measure and document the academic readiness or learning progress or skill acquisition or educational needs of students. Assessments are necessary in education. They're not meant to harm the student or to hold the student back, but rather to help the student learn faster and easier and better. So assessments are used to identify individual students' weaknesses and strengths, to guide in the development of courses and the advancements in teaching strategies, and to identify the need for specialized support, educational program, and/or social services. So now let's talk about the forms of assessment. And there's various forms of assessment. There's high stakes assessments and pre-assessments, formative assessments, summative assessments, interim assessments, placement assessments, and screening assessments. And we'll go through these one by one. The need for assessment is absolutely required for education. So this comic shows a dog and he has a note that says bad dog. He says, I'm going to need more specific feedback on my formative assessments in order to become a better dog. So the first form of assessment we'll talk about is high stakes assessment. So typically these are standardized tests used for the purposes of accountability. So for example, anytime a federal, state, or local government agency wishes to ensure that students are enrolled in effective schools and being taught by effective teachers. High stakes means that important decisions about the students, teachers, schools, or districts are based on the scores of the students. And so they're very high risk tests, high stake tests. There could be punishments, right? There could be sanctions or penalties, reduced funding, negative publicity, not being promoted to the next grade, not being allowed to graduate. All of these can be the result of a bad results on these high stakes assessments. On the other hand, if the student does well in these assessments, there can be awards, public celebrations, public positive publicity, bonuses for teachers, grade promotions, and diplomas upon graduation. The second form of assessments are pre-assessments. So, as the name suggests, these are administered before the student begins a lesson, unit, course, or academic program. In this case, the students aren't usually expected to know most or even any of the material evaluated by the pre-assessments. Generally, these pre-assessments are used to establish a baseline so that educators can measure the learning progress over the duration of the program, course, or instructional period. They're also used to determine the general academic readiness for a course, program, or grade level, or new academic program that a student might be transferring into. It may seem like we're constantly taking tests and that's all that you have to evaluate yourself on. This um, cartoon shows the results, right? I see you did well in school, but what real world skills do you have? And the applicant says tests. I can take tests. There's also formative assessments. So these are in-process evaluations of the student's learning that are typically administered multiple times during a unit, course, or academic program. The general purpose of formative assessments is to give educators in-progress feedback. This feedback can help shape instructional approaches and teaching materials, and the academic support can be modified accordingly. So we will cover a topic and then take a formative assessment and see if the students learned what the topic was. And if not, we can adjust the course of learning to improve their understanding. These are not necessarily always graded. So some of my formative assessments, you either get a 0 if you weren't there, or 100 if you were there and worked on the assignment. So they're not meant to harm the student. They're more a way to get instant feedback so that you can quickly adjust your lesson plan to help the students. Summative assessments are the opposite of pre-assessments. They're used to evaluate the student's learning at the conclusion of a specific instructional period, typically at the end of a unit or chapter or course or semester or program or school year. And these are typically scored and graded tests, assignments, or projects that are used to determine whether the students have learned what they were expecting. There's also interim assessments, and these are used to evaluate where students are in their learning progress and determining whether they are on track. They're used to predict performance on future assessments, such as standardized tests or end of the course exams or other form of some summative assessment. They're usually administered periodically during the course or school year and separately from the process of instructing students. So these are unlike formative assessments, which are integrated into the instructional process. So for example, in my classes, they use worksheets and will lecture and then break up into group and work on these worksheets. And then there's 3 midterms, and these midterms are the interim assessments. There's placement assessments, and as the name suggests, they're used to place students in a course level, or academic program. So for example, these assessments may be used to determine whether a student is ready for Algebra 1 or pre-calc or calculus, and and can be used to assess the student. The assessments are administered before a course or program begins. The basic intent is to match the students with the appropriate learning experience that address their distinct learning needs. These tests are designed to try to help the student by placing them in the level at which they are already at that they already have the knowledge of. There's also screening assessments, and these are used to determine whether a student may need specialized assistance or services, or whether they are ready to begin a course, grade level, or academic program. They may take a wide variety of forms in educational settings, and they may be developmental, physical, cognitive, or academic. For example, a preschool screening test may be used to determine whether a young child is physically, emotionally, socially, and intellectually ready to begin preschool. While other screening tests may be used to evaluate health, potential learning disabilities, and other student attributes. So we have a variety of forms of assessments. We have high-stake assessments, pre-assessments, formative assessments, summative assessments, interim assessments, placement assessments, and screening assessments. Let's look at the design of assessments. So the assessment designs, there's standardized assessments, standard reference-based assessment, common assessment, performance assessment, and portfolio-based assessment. For standardized assessment, these are designed, administered, and scored in a standard or consistent manner. Often they use a multiple choice format, though sometimes they have open-ended short answer questions. Historically, these featured rows of ovals that students would fill in with a number 2 pencil. But increasingly, these tests are computer-based. So they can be administered to a large student population of the same age or grade level in a state, region, or county. And this way, the results can be paired across the individuals and the groups of students. Standard reference or standard-based assessments are designed to measure how well students have mastered the specific knowledge and skills described in a local, state, or national learning standards. They may or may not be based on specific learning standards. So individual schools and teachers may develop their own standard reference or standard-based assessments. A third type are common assessments. These are used in a school or district to ensure that all teachers are evaluating student performance in a more consistent, reliable, or effective manner. They're used to encourage greater consistency in teaching and assessment among teachers who are responsible for teaching the same content. So the idea is that no longer will you have 2 sections of physics, and one of them is really hard and the other one is a little bit easier, depending on the methods used by the teachers to test or assess the individuals. So these allow educators to compare performance results across multiple classrooms or courses, schools, or other learning um, methods. So they share the same format and are administered in consistent ways. So for example, every student is given the same amount of time to complete the assignment, and the teachers give the students, all of the students, the same set of instructions. They use the same score guides and interpret the results in the same manner. Performance assessments, on the other hand, require students to complete a complex task. So this can be writing a paper, doing a science experiment, and creating a report on a lab report. It could be a speech or a presentation, or a dance performance, or a long-term project, for example. So educators will often use collaborative, developed common assessments, scoring guides, and rubrics, and other methods to evaluate the work produced by the students. So performance assessments may also be called authentic assessments, since they're considered by some educators to be more accurate and meaningful evaluations of the learning achievements, and are slightly better than traditional tests. Finally, we have portfolio-based assessments. So I've been using this in my um, uh, first year seminar courses. And the idea is that just like an artist portfolio, where the artist would carry around a portfolio with some examples of their best work. So when they go to apply for a job or something, they can show this person the best work that they have. However, these could be examples of assignments, lab results, writing samples, speeches, and student-created films or art projects. And they're compiled by the students and assessed by the teachers in consistent ways. And these portfolios are often used to evaluate a body of knowledge, the acquisition of diverse knowledge and skills over a period of time. So you may have heard the term e-portfolio. This is an electronic portfolio. And now you can place in your portfolio maybe clips of service engagement that you have taken part in, or um, pictures of posters that you've presented at conferences, as well as your test scores and other things. So the idea is of these portfolios, it's not just test scores that people are looking at. They're looking at a much more diverse collection of all the work that you've done. So for assessment design, we have the standardized assessments, the standards reference-based assessments, common assessments, performance assessments, and portfolio-based assessments. Before I forget, let me tell you that copies of these slides without the voiceover are on Blackboard. So you can go back and look at them if you have wanted to go a little slower, or if you've missed some point during the lecture. So here's a cartoon of how many of us get ready for exams. The mother's talking to her son and says, "Peter, shouldn't you be preparing for your final exams? They're in 2 weeks." And Peter says, "I am preparing." Says, "It looks like you're napping." And Peter says, "I'm getting my mind and body as rested as possible before I start cramming and pulling all-nighters next week." And the mother says, maybe if you started studying this week, you wouldn't need to pull all-nighters next week. And Peter says, that probably makes a lot of sense. But as I said, I'm resting my brain right now and I'm unable to utilize concept or logic, excuse me. And the mother walks away and says, think I need to give my brain a rest before it explodes. So let's look at a summary and give some examples of these types of assessment. So the various forms of assessment, we had high stakes assessments, pre-assessments, formative assessments, summative assessments, interim assessments, placement assessments, and screening assessments. So for the high stake assessments, we said these are usually standardized tests used for the purpose of accountability, where some federal or state or local government agency wants to ensure that the students are enrolled in effective schools and being taught by effective teachers. So for example, New Jersey had the New Jersey Assessment Resource Center, and in July 5th of 2022, the governor of New Jersey signed an act which requires the State Board of Education to administer the New Jersey's Graduation Proficiency Assessment as a field test for the class of 2023. So the idea was that this was really high stakes, that if you didn't pass the test, you weren't going to graduate. So more high stake assessments are, for instance, the graduate record exam, GRE subject tests. And for example, there's tests in mathematics, physics, and psychology. And in order to get into graduate school in physics, many colleges require that you take this GRE. So once again, high stakes. If you do well in the test, you get into a good graduate program. And if you don't get into the graduate program. Another example of high stake assessments are the SATs, where if you do well in the SATs, you can get into a good college and get grants and scholarships. And if you don't do well, you will not. Next, we had pre-assessments. These are given prior to the beginning of a course or course of study to establish a baseline or determine a general academic readiness for a course or program. So for example, in astronomy, or my general astronomy course, students take a pre-test and they complete it before they read anything or come to any lectures. I don't really expect students to know any of the answers. And if we do have a class that knows a fair number of the answers, so let's say we have a class where 80% of the people do above 75%, then we know we can move a little faster and give them a little bit more in-depth information. Most of the time, out of a class of 70, most of the students come up with a 0 to 20% grade. So once again, these are just used to see if where the students are when they start, and then we can use that as the baseline. They take the same test at the end, and although it doesn't come into their grade, I use it to see how well my teaching methods were in getting the ideas across and the concepts. It's also formative assessments. And in these are in-process evaluations of student learning, and they're administered multiple times during a unit or a course or academic program. So for example, my physics class, we'll have a lecture, and during chapter 1, We'll have several of these in-class or several excuse me, midterms to see how the students are doing. We also have summative assessments, and where the midterms give us an idea of how the students will do on their final exam. This is the final exam. So the summative assessments, the student learning at the conclusion of the specific instructional period, or at the end of a unit, or even the end of a course, and they're typically scored and graded tests, assignments, or projects. So for example, a final exam is a summative assessment. Or in my freshman seminar course, which deals with climate, the students write a 5 to 10 page paper on specific locations around the world and look at how climate has been changing there. So once again, this is a final project, and it shows the students' ability to analyze data and also test them on their level of understanding of all the concepts. Interim assessments are used to evaluate where the students are in the learning progress, and determine whether they are on track or not. So for example, homework assignments or quizzes are good examples of interim assessments. There's also placement assessments, and these are used to place students in a course level, or academic program. So for example, Stockton uses the AccuPlacer, and the AccuPlacer to help place students in their math courses. So students take the AccuPlacer, and it determines on whether they end up in pre-calc or calculus or whatever program that is appropriate for them. Screening assessments are used to determine whether students may need specialized assistance or service, or whether they are ready to begin a course, grade level, or academic program. So for example, there's preschool tests, admission tests, to see if students are ready to go into preschool. So with that, we'll end this section, this lecture, and this has been a brief introduction to assessment. I also would like you to watch the YouTube program that I've placed on Blackboard for you, and also to do the homework 1 for introduction to assessment. Okay, thank you, and I will see you next time.